The lasting emotional response that often results from living through or witnessing a distressing event. Okay, so the emphasis is not on what happened, it's on how you, your body, your mind responded to the event. For example, many of us have probably been in a car accident, whether it's a really bad one or just a fender bender, but depending on the person, for some people the car accident could have been extremely traumatic. For other people, they just shake it off and keep going. So it's very dependent on the person, okay? All right, so there are 3 types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. So we're starting with acute. Acute trauma is associated with one single occurrence, one thing that happened. Examples: a car accident, a robbery, maybe witnessing something. And sometimes when people hear the word acute, they think that it means like the instance or the event itself was small, on a smaller scale, not a big deal. That's not the case. Acute just refers to something that happened one time. So I just want to clarify that. Some symptoms that you may have experienced acute trauma: you may feel the need to self-medicate. People often do with drugs or with alcohol. Pulling away from friends and loved ones. You know, if you do tend to have a support system and they're checking up on you to see if you're okay, and you just shut down. You don't want to talk about it. So you're pulling away from them. And depression. All right. Here, chronic. Chronic trauma is when you have reoccurring incidents, so they're happening more than once. Some examples are prolonged abuse. This can be abuse of any kind, war or combat situations. This is often where PTSD stems from, or living in a domestically violent situation. So it's not that you necessarily have to be the victim of domestic violence, but you witnessed it. That can definitely qualify as chronic trauma. And we have a lot more symptoms here. Very common: confusion, anger, sadness, anxiety, rage, overreactions, misperceptions of the individual's environment. So someone could be in a completely safe environment, but they think that everything is a threat. Impaired memories. Sometimes when you're going through trauma, your brain either doesn't remember something at all, or the memory is altered, so it's not as accurate in your mind. Fatigue and lack of sleep. Having some trouble with these. Okay. Complex trauma: exposure to multiple long-term and or prolonged distressing traumatic events that occur over time. So complex trauma is essentially a combination of chronic and acute, okay? It can be different instances that have happened. It could be a one-time event that maybe shook you up a little bit, but then years later something else happened, and you know, these things combined have just really put you into a trauma response. Complex trauma usually tends to occur early in life, not all the time, but because it occurs over a period of time, it normally does occur in childhood. It can disrupt many aspects of development, as well as the formation of a sense of self. We'll talk about that a little more later. And since these events often occur with a parent or a caregiver, they interfere with the child's ability to form a secure attachment, and we'll also be talking about attachments. Many aspects of a child's physical and mental development rely on safety and stability, particularly with their caregiver, okay? This is all foundational. Our sense of safety and stability is rooted in our relationship with our caregiver from infancy. Our ability to develop healthy supportive relationships with friends, significant others, co-workers, all of this has to do with our beginnings, okay? A child with complex trauma history may end up having problems with these sorts of relationships in adulthood. So childhood and adulthood, the symptoms can look a little bit different. If you have a child who has been experiencing complex trauma, then they are going to suffer with minor pain. I'm a teacher, so I have worked with the little kids who I've had a couple kids very regularly. They feel my head hurts, my tummy hurts. And on one day, you know, they eat something wrong, that's normal. But I've had children who often, like a couple times a week, they're complaining of a tummy ache, they're complaining of a headache. This is a very clear sign that they are in distress. Emotional, reactive, they are emotional and reactive. So we've seen children throw tantrums, right? This is not just because they couldn't get the toy or they couldn't eat the cookie. A lot of times this is significant of something else. Or sometimes children will just shut down. So we've seen different kinds of tantrums where they're screaming and stomping around, and then there are the tantrums where they just go, and they're there. They're just frozen, okay? So that's them shutting down. We have dissociation, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and some cognitive issues. So they're unable to think clearly, they're unable to problem solve, and even as children, there are some basic things, right, that children should be able to do. They have a really hard time with this. In adulthood, the minor stomach ache, the minor headache turns into chronic physical pain, okay? So chronic back pain, knee pain, neck pain. Dissociation also happens in adulthood, and this can take form through addiction or self-harm. Anxiety, depressions, feeling of shame or guilt, and lack of emotional regulation. So what I mean by that is, you know, you get really upset by something and it's really hard for you to come back down. You have a hard time calming yourself down, getting back to a regulated state. Trauma also looks like, because a lot of times when we hear the word trauma, we think abuse or, you know, these really big occurrences. Trauma also looks like your reality being denied as a kid, okay? That's not a big deal. Stop crying, shake it off, go somewhere. You know, I don't want to hear that. Hypocritical, toxic parents, okay? Being seen but not being heard, and this is something that, you know, for us, we grew up in households where this was kind of the thing, right? Like, you can be in the room but don't say nothing when all these, you know, this grown folk business, right? We don't want to hear you. But over time, that is programming the child to, you know, I'm not safe to say what I have to say, or my needs are not important. Being an emotional spouse to your parent. This is extremely common, especially in single parent homes, where, you know, maybe the parents are more like bitter enemies, and one parent is constantly venting to the child about the other parent. And these are things that children do not need to be hearing. So they are forced to grow up prematurely, and it's a really heavy mental and emotional burden on them. Racism, okay? You see the cop car in your rear view, you start to freak out a little bit, that's trauma, okay? Even if you have never had a, you know, actual one-on-one negative experience with the cop, the fact that we know that people who look like us do, and that automatically puts us in a place of, you know, high alert, okay? So racism, absolutely. Poverty, religious abuse is a thing, okay? Sometimes growing up in very conservative church cultures where it's almost like you feel like you can't do anything, or where the church culture, you know, everyone is free to judge everybody else, like, oh, the skirt's real short over there, and, you know, I saw you doing this the other day, and, you know, that's not holy. Eventually you start to become mechanical, first of all, and there's also just a complete lack of, you know, being yourself, being authentic, and it eventually results in fear. I know someone shared a story with me. This happened in their church, but a young girl at the church got pregnant out of wedlock, and the church decided to handle it by bringing her up to the front of the church during service, and anyone who wanted to got to reprimand her. And you can imagine the long-term trauma that she's probably dealing with, and you can also imagine she probably don't go to church no more. All right, so some signs of trauma. Trauma has most likely occurred if you show more than one of these symptoms. We talked about this mysterious physical ailments, these chronic ailments that don't seem to go away. And they're kind of mysterious because they're not life-threatening, but they're just a thorn in your side. And every time you go to the doctor, they do these tests and they say nothing's wrong, or I don't see anything, you're fine, but you know you don't feel fine, okay? Eating and sleep disturbances, irritability, having a temper, inability to control emotions, being easily startled. This is actually very common, being easily startled, especially among children. Aggressive behavior, promiscuity, perfectionism, hyper-independence. I don't need anybody. I can do it all by myself. I don't want help. Self-destructive behavior, self-sabotage, difficulty focusing or completing tasks. ADD, ADHD is just skyrocketing right now, and I am convinced that a lot of it is because of trauma, not because they just watch hours and hours of TV, although that is a factor. Low self-esteem, developmental issues, being easily stressed or overwhelmed. Just the smallest thing can tip you over and you just go into freak out mode. Anxiety, depression, workaholism, or just being addicted to staying busy. You just have to go, 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 go. You're not good at resting. All right, so I just wanted to share this. Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, and he was actually trying to figure out what motivates humans, what is behind this motivational behavior, what propels them to do whatever they do. And he ended up coming up with this hierarchy of needs, and the needs are starting from the bottom, so it is going to be extremely difficult to achieve the highest level of self-actualization if you are trying to figure out where your next meal is coming from, or if you're sleeping in your car, or if you didn't grow up in a safe and loving family. So he feels that these things kind of build on each other. All right, so childhood attachment. Attachment theory was invented for the sake of trying to figure out the bond, trying to just better understand the bond between an infant and their parent and how it affects long-term all the way through adulthood, okay? So the pretty much thesis of the study was primary caregivers who are available and responsive to an infant's needs allow that child to develop a sense of security. The infant knows that the caregiver is dependable, which creates a secure base, like home base for the child, and they can always go explore the world. If they get hurt, if they get burned, if they get sad, if they get disappointed, they can always come back home and almost, they know that love is waiting for them, acceptance is waiting for them, and then it, gives them the gusto and the bravery they need again to keep going out in the world. So there were 4 different kinds of attachments that were born out of the study. The secure attachment is the ideal, obviously. The child can depend on their caregiver. When they are separated by their caregiver, they are distressed, but then when the caregiver returns, all is well with the world. You had avoidant attachment. This is usually with caregivers that were neglectful or abusive. When the child was separated from the caregiver, didn't even faze the child, okay? And what's really sad is that, you could pass the baby to the caregiver and you could pass the baby to the stranger and they wouldn't even know the difference. Disorganized. This is when the caregiver is inconsistent. They're there sometimes, they're not, just depends. The child may be disorganized, they may be dazed, they may be confused. Sometimes when they're with their caregiver, they might be smiling, laughing. Sometimes when they're with their caregiver, they might be crying. They're just not quite sure, are you my caregiver, are you not? Ambivalent, so this actually was added years later because they felt like there was some gray area with these other 3 attachment. And this one was with an undependable caregiver, and the child became very distressed, so there was definitely sort of an emotional bond, but a very unhealthy emotional bond. So when the caregiver, leaves, the child is just screaming, crying, inconsolable, and these children tend to grow up becoming very needy. And again, attachment theory is a reflection of the safety and self-worth through the eyes of the child, okay? So how you view your relationship with the caregiver is essentially how you're going to view the world. Okay, so you all have a copy of the ACEs study. This has been studied for years. It's still being studied, but essentially, you know, a group of psychologists wanted to figure out what is the correlation between really negative events that happen in childhood and adulthood. How does it affect adulthood? And the CDC uses this study to this day. This is probably the #1 study when we're talking about children and trauma or traumatic events or negative occurrences in the home. So this talks about potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, so between ages 0 and 17. People who experience ACEs tend to be linked to having health problems, mental health issues, and substance abuse issues in adulthood. Those who have multiple ACEs it will negatively impact job opportunities. These people tend to have a hard time keeping a job. They tend to have less education. It's really hard for them to commit to things. These people are very wishy-washy. And women and minorities are at greater risk for experiencing 4 or more of these ACEs, and you have them on your sheet. And unfortunately, this is not surprising, but that is where we are. So did anybody finish theirs? I'm not going to ask anyone to share scores, but. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in our brain when we're going through these really difficult situations. We're going to break the brain up into 4 different categories or 4 different sections here, okay? We're going to start from the bottom. So we have the brainstem, we have the midbrain, we have the limbic, and we have the cortical. And you can see here, hopefully you can read, it's a little small.